The lawyer's voice filled the room like a verdict already written in stone. "The intentions of the deceased are unambiguous," he announced, smoothing his tie with the practiced calm of a man who had won this kind of case a dozen times before. "My client's daughter is entitled to nothing. Not one asset, not 1 acre, not a single dollar." The judge gave a slow, deliberate nod and reached for his gavel. Across the aisle, my father exhaled like a man who had just watched a mountain crumble exactly where he'd always wanted it to fall. My brother rose halfway out of his chair, clapping once, sharp and triumphant, the kind of sound that rings louder than it should in a high-ceilinged room. I didn't move. I sat completely still, both hands resting in my lap, one of them pressed gently over a plain manila folder. The folder was unremarkable to look at. Thin, worn at the corners, the kind of thing you might use to carry grocery receipts or old utility bills. But inside that folder was something no one in that courtroom had been expecting. I opened it slowly, I looked up, I found my father's eyes and held them. Then I said, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "There's one thing you seem to have overlooked." The room stopped breathing. The judge's gavel hovered. My brother's smile locked halfway across his face like a broken shutter. My father, a man I had watched command boardrooms, dinner tables, and Sunday sermons with equal authority, leaned forward in his chair for the first time that morning with something new written across his face. Fear. Not anger, not disbelief. Fear. And that precise moment was the one I had been quietly preparing for without ever consciously knowing it. But before I tell you what was inside that folder, I need to take you back. All the way back to the beginning. Because nothing that happened in that courtroom makes sense without understanding the 30 years that led to it. My name is Margaret Calloway. I was 62 years old when I walked into that room. I am not a dramatic person. I have never enjoyed conflict. I spent 34 years as a public school librarian in a mid-sized town in central Ohio, a career that my father found politely embarrassing and my brother found aggressively boring. I never chased money. I never built an empire. I drove a sensible car, owned a modest house, and spent most of my professional life teaching children that the right book at the right moment could change everything. My father did not understand that philosophy. Harold Calloway was a man for whom achievement had one language: financial. He measured people the way investors measure portfolios, by return on investment, by visible growth, by the ability to impress strangers at dinner. My brother, Thomas, spoke that language fluently. He was a commercial real estate developer. He knew how to walk into a room, fill it with confidence, and walk back out with a signed contract. My father admired him with the breathless sincerity of a man who had finally found someone worth admiring. I was never that person to him. I understood it. I even accepted it eventually. What I never accepted, what I refused to accept, was losing the man who had always made me feel like I was exactly enough. My grandfather. Everyone called him Grandpa Walt. His name was Walter Calloway, Korean War veteran, third-generation farmer, a man who had been married to the same woman for 56 years, and who, even in his 80s, still talked about her like she was standing just on the other side of a thin wall. When Grandma Eleanor passed in 2011, something shifted in him. Not dramatically, Walt was not a dramatic man, but visibly. The house felt different when you walked in, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. He moved more carefully, as though the rooms had rearranged themselves while he was at the hospital, and he hadn't quite relearned where everything was. The family came around in the beginning. My father visited. Thomas visited. There were phone calls and Sunday dinners and concerned check-ins. But as weeks became months and months became seasons, the visits thinned. Life fills back in after funerals. People return to their routines. The grieving one is left to figure out how to fill the new silence on their own. I noticed it, and I couldn't leave it alone. I started stopping by after work on Tuesdays, just to drop off a few things: bread, soup, the newspaper he liked. Then I started staying for dinner. Then I started coming on Thursdays too. Then Sundays became our standing tradition: coffee and pie and conversation that stretched past sunset without either of us noticing. I was not performing sacrifice. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't logging hours or building a case. I went because I wanted to be there. Because Grandpa Walt was one of the few people in my life who looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room, not because of what I'd accomplished, but simply because of who I was. He would tell stories while we sat on his porch. Stories about farming in the 1950s, about Alina when she was young, about the ways the country had changed, and the ways it hadn't, about the arrogance of every generation that assumed the next one was getting everything wrong. He had a particular laugh for that last subject, low and knowing, like a man who had earned the right to find it funny. Meanwhile, on the other side of the family calendar, my father and Thomas visited during the major holidays, and approximately whenever a conversation about the estate seemed overdue. I noticed the pattern. Grandpa Walt noticed it too, though he never said so directly. That wasn't his way. The practical dimensions of helping an aging person are rarely glamorous. Over the years, I became the one who drove Grandpa to his cardiologist, his orthopedic specialist, his eye doctor. I was the one who sat in waiting rooms with a notepad, writing down medication names and dosage instructions while the nurses spoke too quickly. I organized his bills when the arthritis in his hands made writing painful. I scheduled his prescriptions for pickup so he wouldn't run out. I handled the small avalanche of paperwork that Medicare and supplemental insurance generate for anyone unfortunate enough to need both. None of it felt heroic. It felt like something that needed doing, and I happened to be there. But there were moments in those years that I have carried ever since. One evening, during a particularly brutal snowstorm, the power went out across most of the county. Roads were nearly impassable. The temperature was dropping fast. I loaded the generator from my garage into my car, drove 20 miles on roads that had no business being driven on, and arrived at Grandpa's house to find him sitting in his kitchen in two coats, reading by candlelight. He looked up when I walked in and stared at me like I'd materialized out of thin air. "You drove in this," he said. "Obviously." He shook his head. "You must be out of your mind. Probably runs in the family." He laughed that real laugh, the deep one, and stood up to help me carry the generator in. When we had it running and the lights came back on and the furnace started clicking back to life, he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I still cannot fully describe. "Margaret," he said quietly, "someday you'll understand that showing up is the rarest thing a person can do." I thought he was talking about kindness. I thought he was being generous. I had no idea he was talking about something far more specific. About 3 years before he died, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in his kitchen, Grandpa said something that I have replayed many times since. We were drinking coffee. He was looking out the window at the field beyond the fence line, watching the way the late afternoon light moved through the grass. Then, without turning, he said, "You know what I've noticed about people? They show you who they really are when they believe they're no longer in your debt." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He turned and smiled at me, not a sad smile exactly, a clear one, the kind a person wears when they understand something they wish they didn't. "Nothing," he said, "just observations from an old man." I didn't press him. I respected his privacy more than I respected my own curiosity. But later, much later, I would understand that he had been trying to tell me something specific. He had already begun to see what was coming. He was simply too careful, or perhaps too heartbroken, to say it plainly. In his final 2 years, things changed in ways I found difficult to name. My father and Thomas started visiting more frequently, but the visits felt different. Doors were closed during conversations. Voices dropped when I entered rooms. I caught fragments, attorney, accounts, transfer, restructure, before someone would notice me and the subject would change abruptly to something innocuous about the weather or the local high school sports team. Grandpa seemed exhausted after these visits, in a way he wasn't after mine. One afternoon, after my father and Thomas had driven away, I sat across from him at his kitchen table and asked if everything was okay. He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said something I've never forgotten. "Families get complicated when money starts speaking louder than love." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. You don't have to navigate this alone. His eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen in a while. He squeezed my hand back. Then he changed the subject, and I let him, because sometimes people need you to let them. Several months before he passed, on a quiet Wednesday morning, Grandpa Walt handed me a brass key. It was small, old, the kind of key that belonged to a lockbox or a drawer, nothing fancy. I looked at it, then up at him. What's this for? He smiled. You'll know when you need to know. T. Hat's extremely unhelpful. Most useful things are. I laughed and dropped it into my purse and forgot about it almost immediately. At the time, it felt like another one of his old-fashioned riddles. He was full of them. I had no way of knowing that tiny piece of tarnished metal was going to change the trajectory of everything. He died on a quiet morning in October. The call came early. A neighbor had gone to check on him and found him in his bed, peaceful, as though he had simply decided he was done and arranged himself accordingly. That was so utterly like him that it almost made me smile through the grief. Almost. The funeral drew people from 3 counties: farmers, veterans, church members, former students of his from the agricultural extension program, neighbors who had known him for 40 years. The line stretched out the door of the church and doubled back along the sidewalk. I stood near the entrance and watched them come, and thought that a man's life can be measured in the faces of the people who feel genuine loss when it ends. Grandpa Walt's life measured well. Then the lawyers appeared. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, the paperwork began. Probate filings, court notices, formal correspondence on heavy cream-colored letterhead, and beneath all of it, an undercurrent of confidence from my father and Thomas that I found unnerving. They weren't grieving, not really, they were administering. I received a notice from the probate court. I hired an attorney, a sharp, methodical woman named Carol who specialized in estate law and who had the useful quality of never appearing surprised by anything. I attended the first hearing expecting to be heard. What I got instead was my father's lawyer standing before the judge and explaining, in smooth, rehearsed language, that the will was clear, that my grandfather's intentions were unambiguous, and that I was not entitled to any portion of the estate. That was when I remembered the key. I had found the lockbox 2 nights before the first hearing, in my grandfather's workshop, in a storage compartment behind a stack of seed catalogs that hadn't been moved in years. The box was exactly where he had once, years ago during a completely different conversation, mentioned keeping important personal documents. I had almost forgotten he'd said it. The key fit. I sat alone at my dining room table that night with a cup of coffee and spent 6 hours reading every page inside that box. By the time the sun came up, I was a different person than I had been the night before. The documents told a story that Grandpa had never shared with me directly, and I understood why. He was too proud to paint himself as a victim. He was too private to ask for help when he felt he could still manage on his own. But the records told it anyway. Several years before his death, Grandpa had hired an independent estate attorney, a man named Arthur Weston, retired now, who had practiced law in Columbus for decades. The hiring had been quiet, deliberate, and completely separate from any attorney my father had ever dealt with. Grandpa had gone to Weston with concerns, not accusations, concerns. He had noticed financial activity involving accounts he didn't fully understand, transactions that were explained to him in terms he found confusing, paperwork he had signed without being certain he understood the full implications. He wasn't accusing anyone of theft. He was simply a methodical man who had kept his own books for 50 years and could feel when something didn't add up. Weston's meeting notes were meticulous, every session documented, every concern recorded. One memo read, "Walter Calloway wishes to ensure his estate reaches the individuals he trusts, rather than those who simply assume they are entitled to it." I read it 4 times. It sounded exactly like him, precise, fair, undeniable. There were handwritten letters from Grandpa in the box as well. Personal ones, addressed to no one in particular, more like journal entries. The kind of writing a person does when they need to think clearly and the thinking requires a page in front of them. One line stopped me cold. I am afraid I am being treated as a resource, rather than a father. I sat with that sentence for a long time, because it didn't read like anger. It read like sorrow, the quiet kind. The kind a person carries alone because they're not sure anyone wants to share the weight. Back in the courtroom, the judge accepted the folder. He read in silence. No one spoke. I could hear the ventilation system cycling overhead. My father's lawyer sat very still with his hands folded on the table, watching the judge's face with the focused attention of a man who had just realized his morning might not go the way he'd planned. After several minutes, the judge looked up. "Who is Arthur Weston?" My father's attorney leaned forward. "I'm not familiar with the name, Your Honor." He appears to have served as independent legal counsel to the deceased. The judge turned a page. Privately, beginning approximately 4 years before Mr. Calloway's death. A pause, then. "Were you aware of this, Mr. Calloway?" My father's jaw tightened. "No." The word came out too fast. Too firm. The way people say no when the honest answer is more complicated than a single syllable can contain. The judge returned to reading. Then he reached something that made him stop entirely. He read the same page twice. Then he removed his glasses and looked across the courtroom with an expression that courtroom observers would later describe as more than professionally interested. "There appears to be a trust." If you are unfamiliar with estate law, here is the thing most people don't know. A will and a trust are not the same instrument. A properly structured trust operates independently. It does not pass through probate. It does not respond to a judge's gavel the same way a will does. It follows its own internal instructions, established at the time of its creation, and unless someone can prove those instructions were invalid, they stand. Grandpa Walt had established one. Years before his death. Quietly, properly, with witnesses, with attorney oversight, with every box checked and every form signed. He had funded it methodically over time, transferring specific assets into it, removing them from the probate estate entirely. He had done it because he understood exactly what was coming. He had seen the visits change in character. He had felt the pressure. He had noticed which family members asked about his health and which ones asked about his holdings. He had taken his concerns to an independent attorney, watched those concerns be documented carefully, and then done what any careful farmer would do. He protected the harvest. My father's attorney challenged the documents. Of course he did. He raised objections about provenance, about authentication, about the clarity of intent. Each time he raised one, Carol answered it. Each time he questioned a signature, another piece of documentation confirmed it. Each time he suggested ambiguity, another memo from Arthur Weston closed the gap. The judge listened to all of it. Then he set his glasses down on the bench and spoke directly to my father. "Mr. Calloway, it appears your father took extraordinary measures over several years to ensure his wishes would be honored. Not amended, not reinterpreted, honored." My father said nothing. "I'm suspending the final probate determination, pending a full review of these materials." The gavel came down. I sat in my chair while everyone else began gathering papers and exchanging whispered consultations. The room had the particular energy of a space in which something irreversible had just occurred, and everyone was still processing what that meant for them. My father crossed the room toward me. He stopped a few feet away. His face was red in the way a face gets when embarrassment and anger are competing for the same square inch of skin. "What did you do?" he asked. The question was so strange to me that I nearly laughed. For 62 years, I had been the daughter nobody worried about. The quiet one, the safe one, the one who was never going to cause problems because she was too busy recommending picture books to second graders to develop any real ambitions. "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. "You planned this." "No," I looked at him steadily. "Grandpa planned this. I just happened to be the person he trusted enough to hand a key to." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked away without another word. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon air smelled like rain. The light through the clouds was that soft, particular gray that Ohio does better than anywhere I've ever been. I sat on a stone bench near the parking lot for a long time, not thinking about anything specific, just breathing. I did not feel like I had won something. I felt like I had finally understood something. The investigation that followed over the next 3 weeks was thorough, and I imagine, uncomfortable for everyone involved. The probate court appointed an independent examiner. Financial records going back several years were reviewed. Account statements, transfer authorizations, signature cards, meeting documentation. The picture that emerged was not one of dramatic, explicit wrongdoing. It was subtler than that, and in some ways more troubling. It was the picture of an elderly man being asked to make complicated financial decisions, under time pressure, without full information, by people who stood to benefit from the outcomes. Grandpa had never accused anyone. The documentation didn't accuse anyone, but it described, in careful detail, the nature of those years. Several people who had worked with Grandpa during his decline were interviewed: caregivers, neighbors, his longtime pharmacist. What they described was consistent: an old man who was sharp in conversation, fully present in spirit, but who sometimes emerged from meetings with family members looking as though he'd been through something exhausting, who occasionally asked questions about paperwork he'd already signed, as though trying to walk himself back through the logic, who had once said, to someone he trusted enough to confide in, that he felt like certain people only remembered he existed when there was something they wanted to discuss. One neighbor, a woman named Louise who had lived 2 properties over for 40 years, told investigators that she saw me at the farmhouse almost daily in the final years. She saw my father 3 or 4 times. She saw Thomas perhaps 5. She remembered that clearly because she had found it notable at the time. Arthur Weston's files proved decisive. He was retired, but his records were impeccable. Every meeting dated and documented. Every concern Walter had raised summarized in plain language. Every decision explained in terms of motivation and intent. One memo in particular changed the shape of the entire case. Weston had written, following a meeting approximately 4 years before Grandpa's death. Client expressed concern that certain family members are prioritizing estate planning conversations over personal welfare. Client wishes to restructure holdings in a manner that rewards demonstrated loyalty and genuine care, as opposed to anticipated entitlement. The examiner read that into the record at the final hearing. Nobody in the courtroom had much to say after that. The final hearing was on a Tuesday in late April. Rain fell over downtown Columbus in a steady, unremarkable way. People moved quickly past on the sidewalks, collars up, umbrellas tilted against the wind. It was an ordinary day for everyone else in the city. For us, it was the day the last page turned. I arrived early. My father and Thomas arrived together, 15 minutes before proceedings began. The difference between this hearing and the first one was visible in the way they moved. They walked more slowly. They sat more carefully. The crisp confidence of that first morning, the smiles, the handshake, the certainty, had been replaced by something that looked, from where I was sitting, very much like the specific fatigue of people who have spent weeks realizing they miscalculated something important. The examiner presented his findings methodically. Financial records, trust documents, attorney correspondence, witness statements, property transfers. No single element was explosive on its own. Together, they formed something impossible to dismiss. The judge listened to every word. My father's attorney objected at several points. He questioned interpretations. He suggested alternative readings of certain documents. The judge acknowledged each objection and continued. Arthur Weston's documentation was introduced into the record. When the trust instructions were finally read aloud, the room went very quiet. Grandpa had not disinherited my father and Thomas. He was not a vindictive man, and vindictiveness was never the point. They would receive portions of the estate, smaller portions than they had expected, than they had, apparently, been counting on. The majority of the trust assets were directed elsewhere, some toward charitable causes he had cared about for decades, some toward specific programs in the community where he had lived his whole life, and a substantial portion toward me. The reason, as written in his own documented instructions, was this: Margaret has consistently demonstrated reliability, honesty, and genuine care without expectation of recognition or compensation. She has shown up not because it was convenient or strategic, but because it is her character. I sat completely still while those words were read aloud. I was not thinking about money. I was thinking about the porch, about coffee, about the way his face looked when he laughed at his own jokes, about a snowstorm and a generator and a drive on roads that had no business being driven, about a man who had watched everything carefully for 88 years and had simply been paying attention. The judge upheld the trust. The gavel came down for the final time. No one celebrated. Not me, not Carol, not the handful of people who had supported my position throughout the proceedings. There was nothing to celebrate, really. There was only the conclusion of something long and painful, and the quiet that follows when noise finally ends. My father stood slowly. For a moment he just looked at the floor, then he looked at me. I don't know what I expected in his face. Anger, maybe, or the specific coldness he had always been capable of when he felt he'd been bested. What I saw instead was something I hadn't seen in him before. An old man, confronting the consequences of a very long time, spent misunderstanding what mattered. He didn't approach me, he didn't speak. He walked out with Thomas beside him, and I let them go because there was nothing left to argue about. The documents had made every argument. That needed making. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because I think they matter more than the courtroom does. I spent the first few weeks doing very little except grieving. The legal case had given me somewhere to put my energy during the worst of the loss, and now that it was resolved, the grief had nowhere to hide. It arrived fully. I let it. One Saturday in early May, I drove out to the farmhouse. Spring had reached the fields. The grass was green and new. The air smelled like turned soil. I sat on the front porch for nearly an hour without any particular agenda, no phone, no paperwork, just the sounds of a property that had held a good man's life for half a century. I thought about what I was going to do with it. The answer came more quickly than I expected. Several developers contacted me about the farmland. The offers were serious money. Anyone looking purely at the numbers would have said yes immediately. I turned them all down. Instead, I arranged long-term agreements with 3 local farming families who had worked adjacent land for years. Fair terms, sustainable arrangements, the kind of agreements that let people make a living from soil they love without the threat of it being turned into a parking structure next season. When I signed the paperwork, I thought of the pride in Grandpa's voice whenever he talked about that land, the history of it, the generations who had worked it and the ones who would after. Selling it would have felt like answering the wrong question. I also established a small scholarship fund. Nothing grand. Nothing that will get a building named after it. Enough to provide meaningful support to a few students each year pursuing careers in education, library science, and teaching. At the first ceremony, a young woman accepted the inaugural award with shaking hands and eyes that were clearly losing the battle against tears. She was the first person in her immediate family to attend a 4-year college. She was studying to become an elementary school librarian. I thought of Grandpa during her speech. I thought of all the conversations we'd had about what it meant to spend your life doing something that mattered rather than something that impressed. He would have loved that room. 8 months after the trial ended, my brother called. I almost didn't answer. I did. Margaret, his voice was different, quieter. Something had gone out of it that I wasn't sure I had ever heard absent before. I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. I spent a long time looking for someone else to blame. A pause. Grandpa saw things more clearly than I wanted to admit. He saw things about me that I didn't want to see about myself. I looked out the window at the evening sky, orange at the horizon, going to purple above. I miss him, I said. It was the only true thing I could think to say. Yeah, Thomas said, his voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. Yeah, me too. We talked for almost an hour. Not about money, not about the trial, about Grandpa, about memories, about regret. about the particular weight of realizing, too late, that you were standing at the edge of something irreplaceable and choosing not to step toward it. It didn't fix 30 years. Nothing could. But it was a beginning. Small ones are the only kind that last. My father never offered a formal apology. I don't think he knew how. Some people spend so many years constructing a version of themselves that doesn't make mistakes that they lose the ability to acknowledge the ones they've made. The hostility faded eventually, replaced by a cautious civility that suited both of us better than open war had. We spoke occasionally. About surface things. It was enough. Nearly a year after the trial, I returned to the farmhouse to collect the last few remaining personal items. Most everything had been distributed. What was left fit into a handful of boxes, photographs, letters, old documents, the accumulated debris of a life lived carefully and long. Inside the last box, beneath a stack of old Christmas cards and a folded farm map from 1963, I found an envelope. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. My hands were not steady when I opened it. The letter was short, 4 paragraphs. He had written it approximately 8 months before he died, when I think he understood that the time for open conversations was narrowing, and he wanted to put certain things somewhere permanent. I won't quote it in full. Some things belong to the people they were written for. But one passage I will share, because it is the truest thing anyone has ever said to me. He wrote, "Money has a way of removing everyone's mask. It shows you who chases, who protects, and who never noticed it enough to do either. The rarest people are those who simply stay, who show up, who bring groceries and ask how you slept and don't keep a ledger of the favor." And then, at the very end, the real inheritance was never the land or the accounts. It was always the knowledge of who you are when you're not being watched. That's the thing no court can grant, and no document can revoke. That's what I wanted you to carry. I sat on the floor of that farmhouse for a long time after reading it. The evening came in through the windows. The fields went dark outside. I thought about a brass key, about a courtroom and a manila folder, and a judge who had seen enough estate cases to know what they really revealed. I thought about my father's face in the moment before the gavel fell for the last time. And I thought about 30 years of Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons and icy drives on impossible roads. About all the ordinary moments that had built something between two people that no will could transfer and no lawyer could argue with. People who hear the outline of this story usually focus on the courtroom part. They want to know about the legal strategy, the surprise, the reversal. But when I think about what actually happened, the courtroom barely figures. What I think about is a man on a porch watching the light change over his fields, talking about the things that mattered to him. I think about the smell of his kitchen in the mornings. I think about the way he laughed. I think about all the days I showed up not because I was building toward anything, but because being there was simply the right thing to do. Grandpa Walt spent 8 decades watching people. He knew the difference between those who stay and those who circle. He knew the difference between love that shows up at 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Wednesday and love that shows up when there's something to be signed. He prepared carefully for what he feared was coming because that was the kind of man he was. Patient, methodical, certain that the truth, properly documented and properly protected, would eventually speak for itself. And it did. If someone in your life has been quietly, consistently present during your hardest years, not for credit, not for an audience, but simply because that is who they are, I hope you tell them what that has meant. Not in a will, not in a letter to be opened after you're gone. Now, while there is still time to see their face when you say it. The greatest inheritance is not what we leave behind. It is what we build inside the people who love us, the understanding of what it means to stay, what it means to show up, and why none of the rest of it matters the way we think it does. Grandpa Walt knew that. He spent his whole life proving it. And in the end, he found one person who had learned it well enough to carry it forward. I hope I am doing him justice. If this story stirred something in you, a memory of someone who showed up for you when it cost them something, take a moment today to reach out to them. And if you've learned the hard way that character outlasts everything else, I'd be honored to hear your thoughts. Thank you for spending this time here. Take care of the people you love while they're still present to receive it.